Hello, everyone. My name is Len DeLaura, an Associate Professor of Practice at LTU. Welcome to the third lecture in our mini lecture series. Today's lecture on the future of libraries is sponsored by Interior Environments. The topic of the library is a result of the confluence of a few different conversations and initiatives. This semester, my interior design studio class is doing a design project around the campus library with amazing input and insights provided by the library team and students on campus. We also have another studio, our comp design studio, working with a library program this semester. Our previous lecture was from Janice Suchin and Todd Stevens, and our final lecture features Brooke Julian, Strategic Account Manager, Public Sector at Allsteel, who will introduce us to understanding the evolving role of the academic library on Tuesday, April 26th at 6 p.m. Visit our co-ed lecture page to register. Joining us today to discuss the project is Kelly Haig and Ben Utes of Design Lab Architects. Kelly Haig, AIA, IIDA lead, and Ben Utes, AIA, and lead are partners at Design Lab Architects, a Boston-based women-owned studio founded in 2005, devoted to creating places that reflect the mission and identity of institutions, cities, and individuals. Their studio has underlined their commitment to transparency, equity, and social justice through their JUST label, a program administered by the International Living Future Institute. A core facet of Design Lab's work is in the renovation and rehabilitation of historic and mid-century structures, largely within nonprofit and higher education settings. These projects excite us because they exist at an improbable intersection, that of the past and present, of preservation and innovation, of heritage and ingenuity. They operate within a philosophy they call critical stewardship, an approach to design based on the universal responsibility to history and the environment as valued through the lens of community. The stewardship of their valuable resources, environmental, built, or cultural, is emboldened by creativity, which is critical in both senses, essential yet offering critique. Critical stewardship reflects that the architecture of today is part of a historical and environmental continuum. With each intervention, be it a revitalization or new construction, they guide an evolution. Please help me in welcoming Kelly and Ben.
Well, good evening,
Hi.
everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction.
Yes, thank you. Let us know if you can't hear us, but Ben and I are very excited to be here with you all virtually tonight to present some of our work and some of the work that we are inspired by that look at shifting paradigms, specifically shifting paradigms of libraries within historic structures. So to give you a little bit of background to our firm, as you now know, we are Design Lab Architects, a 15-person firm in Boston, and Ben and I are two of the four partners currently there. We do operate in a philosophy called critical stewardship, by which we celebrate and leverage the past for tomorrow. So it is an approach to design that is based on a universal responsibility to both history and environment as it's valued through the lens of community. So through critical stewardship, it reflects the architecture, that architecture today is part of a historical continuum and that we're all a part of it. So every time we have a project, and quite a bit of our work is in adaptive reuse or renovation work, Each of those we think of as an intervention that's about guiding an evolution. And so even though, you're building what seems like timeless, permanent buildings, that they're actually quite malleable and that, they're a result of decisions that we make. So we as architects and you as future architects and designers have the power to and responsibility to kind of usher that environment forward with care. So, we think of each of our projects as a single moment on this continuum. And what's great about this lens of community is that it really allows us to focus our attention toward the people and the program and purpose of the building and away from things.
Well, hopefully that gives you some good context on our overall design approach and philosophy. Specific to libraries, we've had the fortunate privilege over the years to be engaged in a wide range of library work. It's quite the spectrum from public libraries in both sort of small town, kind of rural environments to public libraries in very dense urban environments, academic libraries and research libraries. This is just a sort of smattering of our work on the screen you see here. And we've come to acknowledge a series of commonalities between library typologies, and we'll be sharing some thoughts on that this evening, but also many distinctions between library types based on the type of library they are, or the program that they provide, or the community that they serve. And as Kelly said, we're always looking towards our peers and other library and planning thought leaders to inform our own research approach and thinking. And one recent innovation in library planning that's emerged over the years is the adaptive reuse of existing non-library buildings to house library functions. This is an interesting example in McAllen, Texas, where an abandoned big box retail store, I think it was a Walmart, was actually repurposed into a large single floor, the largest single floor library in the country. And in Chicago, two recently completed projects, these are not ours, but they innovatively merge two building typologies into one. They take market rate apartments for an urban community and pair those with the neighborhood branch library, creating a very sort of vibrant mixed use space. A very clear shift in the library paradigm over the years has emerged. This is, in the past 10, if not a little bit longer years, where libraries are no longer book repositories for the single reader. And we'll talk a lot about that this evening. Libraries have become much more vibrant with much more variety, both in the types of spaces they provide to users and patrons, but also the resources and services they offer and how those resources and services are offered to support a much more active learning and collaborative environment. We like to relate this shift with an analogy that we've borrowed years ago from the director of the Providence Public Library, where libraries used to sort of be similar to a grocery store in that you would go to the library or the grocery store, you'd check out or buy certain items, and then you'd bring them home to consume. But now libraries are the kitchen itself, fostering an inclusive community environment for gathering, for sharing research and discourse, and exploring new ideas.
So we've come up with some ways to start to think about the libraries, both in terms of the programs within the library, but also give us some frameworks through which we can start to reimagine, or some kind of common languages and processes. So the first series of diagrams we're going to show you is a framework we put together to start to think about how this paradigm shift has impacted the programs that we're designing for. So in this matrix, we have at the x-axis this idea of consumption, as Ben said, going to check out the resource, to creation, which are two different ways of thinking of how you engage with knowledge. And then on the y-axis, it's the participant itself. So is it for an individual or is it for many people? And all of those have pretty big impacts on how you start to think about space and programming and adjacencies, things of that nature. So if you look back at kind of 19th, 20th century historic libraries, frankly, libraries before that as well, but a lot of the ones that are in play now are from the 19th and 20th centuries. You know, the programs really operated kind of largely in one quadrant. And as Ben said, it was largely about going to consume research, oftentimes as one person. There might be a great reading room that you're kind of independently, reading alongside other thinkers, but for the most part, it was a fairly solitary experience. And so you see coming out of this time, really kind of incredible monuments to architecture, monuments to knowledge, um, big rooms that were very quiet, and it was about, you know, study and real kind of poring over books and spreading out and knowledge gaining. And, in the 20th century, it was really about uh, holding the book, right? So big book repositories, lots of stacks. This is the Kahn Library at Phillips Exeter. And, while he does have space for, again, large group reading at the center, a lot of the individual study carrels at the perimeter are still all about the individual person, and it's all about the book. But as the 21st century has come and technology has made such a huge shift, we find that the spectrum has varied quite a bit. So, we see everything from film viewings and StoryCorps and digital labs, lots of computers and maker spaces, even towards, performance and events and hosting weddings. So I think when you start to think about the kinds of spaces that a library both today and into the future require, it's quite a stark shift from what was. And so we start to see this reflected in the architecture itself. So this is the Fleet Library at RISD, which was built by Office Daw. And, they basically inserted this large intervention in the middle of a historic bank. So as this object in a field, and on each side of it, there's kind of a different kind of resource, but not a whole lot of stacks. It's fairly minimal in terms of the grand kind of hall space. But what strikes us about this project is that it's really much more about kind of crafting a user experience than high density bookshelves, which is a pretty stark shift from some of the earlier libraries you see. And also, this is a project Ben and I worked on, Claire T. Carney Library. And here, there were needs, it's an academic library. There were needs for quiet reading room, which you see below, but also computer labs and places for technology and places to have more bustling, classes, things of that nature. And that, it was really important to start to connect those things and get some visual connection and understand that it's kind of two sides of the coin. This is a pretty new project. It's the Hayden Library. It's a renovation of a historic library, but it's at MIT and was built by Kennedy Violich. And the redesign of the Hayden Library, it transforms the 1951 modernist repository into a really dynamic and inclusive learning space. So it's all about collaboration and research. And this research crossroads concept highlights different ways of thinking at the intersection of kind of digital and analog. So we also understand that where you fall along the spectrum changes a lot based on the um, kind of library and the kind of community you're serving. So we have worked on town libraries, and the program is really geared towards a wide range of users. You have lots of kids programming, community services, adult education. So it kind of operates along a spectrum, trying to give as many varied services for people. Oftentimes, as much of a community center as it is, about the book as an academic endeavor in and of itself. Schools tend to lean towards group user experience, and it is very child centric. So it's about books and play and story time, and kind of engaging together as, building this love of learning at a young age. We've worked on a number of urban libraries that often cater to a large and diverse group of people that are both local community members, but also people who come from far away to visit the library. So in these, oftentimes it's where we see the film festivals and curated archives that are all about talking about, the history of the town and the place, or the city itself. So you're in these urban libraries, oftentimes you're kind of a microcosm of a much larger network of libraries. And we also see these oftentimes as venues, and they can be a central hub. So this is the Providence Public Library, which we worked on, and it is a central hub connected to other branch libraries. But because it was such a beautiful historic space, they were able to also embed infrastructure so that it could double as events. And those events that they have at this library, some of them are very community based in education and festivals, things of that nature. And some of them are private and corporate events that fund all of the other program at all the other branches. So it's a way to start to think about new models of just supporting library programming. Academic libraries really run the spectrum, and they need a broad range of resources and spatial types. Just not only because you have a diverse set of learners and kind of learning modalities, but also because the university library flexes a lot throughout the semester. So the kinds of use and needs and density at, say, the beginning or middle of a semester are very different than the end of the semester. So building in that flexibility to adapt to different influxes of people is really important.
So as the libraries have evolved, and the types of spaces they've provide have evolved, service models have also evolved dramatically, both physically and spatially. But just as important, and maybe even more importantly, are the types of services and resources offered. There's much more services offered in today's library than there were in libraries just 20 years ago, and certainly more than libraries of the previous century. It's no longer, just about these printed collections, but objects and tools and new technologies that you can borrow, and access to digital media and collection. And as such, the way in which librarians and staff and patrons engage with these resources has evolved. There's certainly still this idea of the centralized model, which exists in many libraries, where they're organized around a central, circulation or reference or resource desk. This still exist, but they're often more specialized points of service within that larger centralized space. We've looked a lot to retail models. Where there still may be a central location or hub with library staff, but there are satellite locations that offer specialized services or resources that sometimes and often are completely digital, much like how you grab your boarding pass at the airport without engaging anybody from customer service directly. Yet, if you need to engage somebody from customer service, they're there and available to help you should you need them. Of course, there's the Genius Bar model, like the Apple Store, where there are very specialized areas of service, or specific resources are located at different locations throughout a building, depending on what's being offered. And self-checkout, of course, has existed for many years now in libraries, but it continues to evolve and advance following retail models like Amazon Go. And all of this sort of shifting of access to services and the types of services, has informed, and it continues to inform, the architecture of a space and how it's arranged or laid out.
So at its broadest, at its broadest statement, designing a library is not a one size fits all approach. And so when you enter into library planning, you really have to think about the people and the placemaking. Library programming has to be driven by the kind of clear impact, in that when you're renovating a structure, you really need to find a way and some tools and criteria for how you manage that evolution. So we've developed this set of 5 criteria so that you can transition libraries into the future, which we've distilled into restore, innovate, tailor, curate, and engage. So we're going to give you a few examples of each of them and how it kind of shifts our thinking and how we start to plan and design libraries.
So, as we've been saying, a lot of our work, deals with, renovating or repurposing existing buildings of architectural, historic or cultural significance. And we really want to draw from the strengths and assets of that original building to elevate its legacy. But at the same time, allow opportunity for interpretation to transform existing buildings and their original design intent into a 21st century learning environment. Because, as we've been discussing, so much has evolved programmatically in libraries. So the architecture of 50 years ago no longer suits, the needs of a library today. So one of our most recognized projects at Design Lab is our transformation of the Claire T. Carney Library at the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth, which is about an hour south of Boston. This was completed around 10 years ago, so it's hardly a current library, but I think a lot of what we learned and experienced on that project is still very relevant today and relevant to our thinking, particularly to critical stewardship. So this was a 1.5 million square foot campus, all designed and built in the 1960s, and it was designed by renowned architect Paul Rudolph. And his utopian vision was to create a campus with a sense of community and unity as if it were a single building. And the library, as it's seen here in this image, was its centerpiece. Rudolph's sculptural and brutalist forms were originally bathed in natural light and complemented with a rich palette of vibrant textiles. But over the years, these features were removed, and as new generations of students and faculty came and went, Rudolph's original vision and intention was sort of lost to the test of time. And through much study and much research and much deliberation, our team reintroduced a palette of materials to complement the original composition. And those were materials that we knew existed in the original composition, but also new materials that we brought ourselves to the composition to enhance what was once there. And we also introduced new types of spaces to support a learning community and a library that was much different in 10 years ago than it was in 1960. So, through that interpretation and then transformation, we leveraged the original architectural vision into a new, vibrant 21st century learning environment. At Brandeis University, it was a similar effort. It was a mid-century library, but much less known architecturally. You can see in that historic photo. And as seen here, the floor plans were dominated heavily by stacks, which of course was very common of the time. We completed a master plan for this entire library complex, and I should say the kind of bottom right of the plan was the original 1950s building, and then the sort of upper left sort of satellite that was added in the 90s as the university expanded. But through our master plan, we sought to break up the monotony of the stack area by consolidating the printed collections into compact shelving and actually purging the printed collections into a digital resource, thereby allowing the floor plates to be completely replanned to support new uses. And we leveraged the original architecture, particularly these moments at the perimeter, to house a series of special collections and programs to support the evolving library paradigm and all of the new needs of a library and all of the new needs of student learners, creating an open, welcoming, and much more easily navigated library environment.
So if we agree that libraries are no longer just warehouses for books, how do you start to combine old and new resources together in the library? And, how do you start to think of state-of-the-art programming as part of this new set of resources? So new spaces for collaboration and experimentation can be created by introducing transparent and inviting flexible workrooms. This gives access to new technology and also just kind of showcases the work that's happening. An experiential research library, for example, could be composed of this integrated series of labs or collaboration suites for digital media, hybrid learning, data visualization, and collaboration. And we also know that libraries need to have specialty spaces for areas like digital scholarship and research computing, special collections, and curriculum labs for libraries. So when you start to set up rooms as permanent and short-term and flexible, it can really start to impact the kinds of spaces that we create. And I think what's so wonderful about this, again, is that there's some opportunity to showcase like a storefront, the offerings of the library, so that people passing through can really get a sense of all that happens behind the scenes. Another example at the Hayden Library at MIT, where they use a variety of spaces and technologies to support different kinds of research and access to digital resources. And this project actually inspired us at a project we did at UConn. It was a conceptual design study rethinking their Homer Babbage library. And we started to consider these salon type experiences. So, informal mixing opportunities for users to have dialogue and see works in progress and really kind of happen upon new ideas and new ways of thinking. And so, the space was really about supporting spontaneous collaboration and just cross disciplinary exploration. And so this is an example of some early conceptual ideas. We had a largely flat rectangular uh, floor plate in this historic container. There was really not a whole lot of programming or stack need at that level, but there were a lot of services they wanted to bring, and it was a major kind of route on campus. So what they wanted to do is really think of it as this kind of terminal experience where you go and you can see all that's happening as you move through this plaza level. So we were trying to think of, how you start to insert new programs in a way into this box that can really animate that experience and give you the range of use and program that they're looking for. So this is where we landed in terms of kind of crafting these objects in a field. And based on how they were positioned in the floor plan, it really separated kind of active spaces and quiet spaces. It allowed for individual and also collective rooms and experiences. And that, the opportunity was to make a really fluid, dynamic space where people could be kind of drawn into different aspects of learning and knowledge. And so just really creating this thoroughfare that showcases the work and scholarship. And what was just so wonderful is that as we started this, the library, the dean of the libraries, or she was the interim dean at the time, was saying, it is a library. It's not a student center, right? And it's not just a living room. We want it to be about scholarship, and we want people to come in and have a sense of books and resources. So it was great because it really was about kind of bringing knowledge and celebrating knowledge and putting it on display. So a really critical challenge in the future library is creating healthy and beautiful spaces that also work with a wide range of learning styles and types of study. We know that there are many types of learning modalities and needs, and people thrive in very different situations. So, we really want to think about how these environments can be custom designed or tailored to meet and serve a wide range of users and stakeholders. So understanding that library planning is about people, we, have started to think about different kinds of passions and interests and personalities that come to the library, because each of those have a different implication on the types of space you design. So while we know that the specific mix of the program ends up kind of coming out of the stakeholder engagement that we have with the individual client, that you really need this variety of scale and types to enrich the library experience. So if you range from quiet and focused to informal and conversational, to really broad and active and vibrant spaces, you can really allow users to select their own preferred kind of workspace. And so in our experience, we know that hearing directly from that wide range of voices really enhances the process. So we, as a firm, are really committed to a really engaged collaborative process. We want to make sure that we have all the people at the table who are going to be impacted by the project, maybe beyond just the people who are, facilitating the project or, paying for the project. We know that, there are many people who are going to be touched by it. So we always start our process. This is one that a map that we did for the Boston Public Library, where we map out the community and we start to identify like who are the key stakeholders, what are the types and frequencies of engagement that each of these has, and like how can we bring them into the conversation and start to understand what their needs are and what their aspirations are. And so, we've developed a whole range of tools for engagement with all of these folks, whether it's the students or the faculty or library staff or, the patrons of the branch communities. And that ranges from interactive hands-on workshops, which are ideal, but obviously, specifically in the last couple of years, the kind of engagement that you can get in a digital world has really advanced and accelerated. So we have a lot of different tools, and each of those engage a different set of users. So we always want to make sure that we are really thoughtful about how we start to craft the project, how we start to, advertise for these group meetings, just so that we can kind of collect the broadest amount of information possible to help us make our decisions. Um, These are some images from the West Branch Library, which was a branch library in Somerville, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. Um, and it's a community of folks that have a lot of diverse needs. And we had a very involved process to start to understand, what was really working about they had a historic Carnegie era library, what was really working for them, what was missing, what did they really want out of this renovation? Because we knew that, ultimately the library was going to be for them and their community. And so we came up with this solution where it was both making the current library accessible and really renovating and highlighting the historic learning spaces that were part of that original library, but also adding on this community room to the back, which could serve larger functions and events that gave way onto an outdoor plaza space. So we were really trying to kind of gain a lot with a relatively small footprint in a pretty tight urban neighborhood. And just a few, oh, did we miss the images?
Which ones?
Oh gosh, maybe I have an extra one. Keep going.
Okay. Um, so, we want to, as we've been talking about here, create and curate library services today so they can be reconceived to support new models of learning and best leverage the expertise of the library and the staff. So, libraries were longstanding repositories for books, and technology continues to evolve. At one point, the future of libraries was the microfiche, which of course is no longer the case, and that didn't really, take off. But the thinking is still very relevant. And one thing that we are constantly reminding ourselves is that one of the most important things about libraries is not the books or the resources themselves, but actually the service personnel and the librarians, because they understand what resources are available and can make those available to users. So there are all these different conceptual models that we've talked about that we've developed for our sort of library planning and exploration as a starting point to strategize service points. And those refer to both the location for library staff, but as well as digital services, like we've been saying. And we find inspiration in all sorts of different retail settings. And by using this information, we explore ideal service models and adjacencies. And often we're strategically distributing specific collections, be it digital or traditional, throughout a library, and understanding how they best align with service points that can create a much more engaging environment between user and collection and allows librarians to work more effectively and efficiently. We also really want to curate spaces to create a cohesive user experience and a sense of place. So in a study for the Langsdale Library at the University of Baltimore, we created a strategy of distributing activities and programs throughout the multi-story building by creating a unique experience on each floor. And that distinct character and zones per floor provide a different atmosphere on each floor, yet they're done in a cohesive way, creating better orientation throughout the building. And one of the key tools that we use to create and curate this cohesive user experience is graphic and wayfinding strategies that allow us to create distinct spaces, yet this cohesive and intuitive overall environment. Going back to the Claire T. Carney project that we described earlier, as I alluded to, we took a very, very deep dive into understanding Rudolph's approach to materiality and the use of color within his own work to develop our approach for the use of the color in building, which you can see in this diagrammatic section, where we used a more vibrant color combination on the lower, most active floors of the library and a lesser calmer combination of colors on the quieter upper levels. But we also look to popular culture and op art of the era to help inform and broaden our understanding of the use of color and graphic of the time. And, with this understanding and research in place, we knew from the very beginning, at the very earliest stages of concept design, that we wanted to reintroduce color into the project in a meaningful way as a way to unify the building experience as Rudolph originally intended. And it took a lot of convincing to campus leadership, but we ultimately prevailed, and all stakeholders wholeheartedly embrace our approach and the results, more importantly, including campus leadership, library staff, and most importantly of all, the students.
And finally, we move on to this idea of engaging. And, for us, we believe that asking how the library can create interdisciplinary collaboration and connect academia to practice is important, because it's about kind of benefiting the local community and really tapping into unrealized potential. At the Boston Public Library, we did a study last year that it's a central library with a pretty broad network of branch libraries in the various neighborhoods. And so it was this really amazing process of trying to understand what to do with this, historic icon of a building, but also think more broadly about how it can serve in a broader setting. So through the community meetings, we did hear a lot of similar echoes that there's this opportunity for it to have a stronger connection outward. And the McKim building and the integrated artwork and all the architectural details are arguably some of the most valuable resources that the public library has in its collection. So, in this building, the art and architecture are really inseparable and kind of thought of and conceived of as one. So the Boston Public Library has a rich history of arts and symbolism that's integrated into the building. And it's been well documented as it's reached its 125th anniversary in 2020. And as we started to note this and notice it and consider all the neighborhoods that are tied to this central library, we started to really think about that symbolism in a different way. The etchings and murals and mosaics in detail, they all tell these stories and celebrate great thinkers, authors, artists, allegorical figures. They were collected in this building to inspire the patrons of the time to search for knowledge and really celebrate and honor the culture and community. But while it's, exquisitely beautiful and valuable by maybe what we would tend to think of as beautiful architecture, for many that the building serves, certainly in some of the neighboring communities, it's really actually austere and not really familiar and welcoming. And if you look at the names, the artists and images don't represent the full spectrum of the Boston citizens or the visitors and patrons that come there. So, it really made us curious about, what the building as a symbol is really reflecting outward. And so we studied an index of all the people that, the McKim building was commemorating. And perhaps not news to you all, certainly not news to us. The symbolism is overwhelmingly white, male, and Eurocentric. The historic figures that are populated on the base map based on the country of origin. So there are a total of 151 historical figures, and in total, 69.5% originated in just 3 countries, which were the United Kingdom, the United States, and Italy. Only 5 of all 151 were women. And only one figure, Confucius, was a person of color. So that resulted in over 99% being of white European descent. And, it's no doubt that in recent times, we're really starting to pay attention to monuments and what they mean and what they represent. And, we, Design Lab, recognize that buildings are a monument. So we start to think about how we can usher these buildings into a new time period, kind of reckoning with that history and finding ways to evolve it toward the values and the culture we want to instill. And just, the rethinking of monuments is not just in Civil War icons, but this is the Christopher Columbus, which was a target in Boston. And so for us, it's really reconsidering and repositioning the future library so that we're creating places to learn and inspire knowledge, and that these places reflect our values and culture so that as they evolve, they're really conscious and geared toward the future generations.
All right. Well, I think we're just about on time. Got some time here for questions and answers.
I'd like to thank you both for a great presentation. It's a very timely presentation. Thanks for sharing some of the examples from the Rudolph building. We have currently in our campus, our library is in a brutalist building. Unfortunately, color, I don't think was one of the aspects because concrete's the predominant material being used. And it's in the basement with no windows. So we have a tough project that we're working on. I also
It can be made
appreciate
better.
I also appreciate your tie-in with a sense of place. We just talked about this in our environmental psychology class last week, the whole idea of place, a sense of place, place attachment. So thank you for that. I'm going to pan the audience to see if we have any questions. Any questions from the group online? Nothing yet. So I'm going to ask the first question.
Go for it.
Thank you for sharing your design process and that axis that you laid out. And I had a whole series of questions, but your 5 steps answered a lot of them. So that was an awesome presentation of how you went through that. Are you ever asked about future-proofing a library? Like what are clients asking for? How long did they see the shelf life if they're even talking about something like that for a library?
That's a great question. I feel like for me, I would answer it in 2 ways. I think that we do a lot of both education and arts spaces. And I think what is an interesting overlap in both of those programs is that they are both so impacted by technology and the rapid pace of technology changing how people engage and what people make and how people think, that I feel like we're constantly asked for, you know, to like design a space for technology that we don't know about yet, and like thinking about flexibility and thinking about adaptability, so that it's not that you're future proofing it and it's never going to be dated, but that you're building in ways for it to shift and evolve over time, which is hard to do, but also I think a good check. And I would say the second thing I've heard more and more of that is because we do have a lot of our work is with mid-century structures. And so in the placemaking, we're doing vibrant colors, like motifs that go back to the 70s. And like, we really want to celebrate that because that is the history of that building. And we have heard a few times like, well, what about timelessness? And it's such an interesting question because like buildings are based in time and they reflect a time, and I think oftentimes people think timeless is what you aspire to, but like how can you be timeless without going through time? So it's a really interesting question that we grapple with because ultimately I think if you make a really beautiful aspirational space that people love, it will eventually feel timeless. But it's a really, I think, as a designer, a hard thing to be a goal, you know? I don't know. For me, I like have a hard time wrapping my head around how to build something today with the technology and skill sets we have as, architects that is timeless.
I'd add just, on the topic of, future proofing, flexibility is key. It's a really hard thing to manage. As Kelly was describing, I recently heard, and I couldn't help but chuckle, a client of ours at a higher ed institution who does a lot of just internal planning and projects. And, they referred to flexibility as the F word because they hear it so often from staff and users and faculty, but it's a really hard thing to plan for the future when you don't know exactly what the future holds. But one thing that we've started to see is interior environments that perhaps are less sacred, maybe, is a way to think about it, where they're a little bit more rough and ready. And as Kelly said, we do a lot of work in the arts, and that's a kind of very kind of rough and ready environment often. But it's spaces where there's tons of power, there's tons of data.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there's open ceilings, there's no hard ceilings, there's less and less drywall partitions. It's more about demountable partitions that can move and can shift, and office furniture solutions that can move and shift. And you can always plug things in here or there to support different uses. That was a big goal. It's not a project we worked on, but it's a project we know an awful lot about over at Northeastern University here in Boston. It's the Snell Library, and their president has a very ambitious vision for the future of their entire campus based in AI, and they've got some really amazing things going on, and they wanted their library to be this sort of hub of interdisciplinary research and the opportunity for all these different groups to kind of come together and smash together in ways that you couldn't do anywhere else on campus. And they just wanted it uber flexible to support a capstone group one semester and then shake that up and support an entirely different group the next semester. So that was all about like, how can you do that? How can you create an environment that can literally shift, 3 or 4 months from one type of use to the next? So much less about like traditional building methods and much more about sort of systems furniture and
Mm-hmm.
partition solutions.
And I will say, just if I could build on that for a minute, like I haven't heard you say about the F word with flexibility, but I love that. We'll talk more about that later. But um, we often say in these both in libraries and in art centers, like I said, there's a lot of parallels, I think. And one of them is with flexibility. It's like you can be very flexible and do lots of things less well, or you can be specialized and do like one or two things expertly well. And so, there's always this um, process of guiding and figuring out what your priorities are. And, to Ben's point with infrastructure, like maybe there are a handful of very specialized, exquisitely, constructed spaces that are signature and are lasting, and then maybe there are lots of other spaces that can change and adapt over time. And so you're trying to balance both kind of more temporal and changeable with more maybe lasting or long-term spaces. And that's just a process of trying to weigh your priorities, figure out exactly, what they need and their flexibility, and just, I think just try to serve them in the best way that suits, that institution's needs.
It was kind of like our object in the field idea at the University of Connecticut, where there were these very specialized spaces to support events, to support learning. Those were the kind of objects within this really huge, floor plate. And then the space around it, the field, was much more amorphic. Things could shift and move and support different uses. Furniture types could move all over the place. So it's kind of that duality that Kelly was just describing.
Well, thank you for the answer to that. I greatly appreciate it. Another question that I have regarding let's say go back to the programming process.
Mhm.
Do you find, and Ben, I'm tying this into your comment about sacred spaces, do you find that libraries are coming to you with ideas of what they want their library to be like, or is it you coming to them with a new set of cultural ideas and how libraries are operating today and all of that? Or is it a combination of both? How is that working in your area when a library approaches you for design?
I guess we've seen it in all three of those kind of spectrums. I mean, it depends an awful lot on the leadership of the particular library or institution, and where, what types of libraries they've worked at previously, where the vision of the institution is headed. Um, I'd say most often though it's probably the combination where they there's certain program or spaces that a particular library knows they want, and
Mhm.
then through our programming intervention and just sort of this knowledge sharing and what are the trends of libraries and just kind of providing this broader spectrum of where libraries are headed, we can sort of infuse new uses or new types of spaces or programs into their thinking.
Mhm.
um,
Yeah, I agree. I feel like, there's usually one or two things that's really important to the leadership. And just to give a couple of examples of how those are different, um, at UMass Dartmouth, I remember Catherine Fortier Barnes. She wanted people in the library. Like she almost didn't care if they were playing video games or sleeping. She wanted them there. She wanted the library to be a home. She wanted people to go through every day. Like she wanted students in that space. And so, a lot of the other stuff that surrounded that, of like how to get them there, how to keep them there, how to bring them back many times, some of that we helped fill in the blanks and we could show her examples. But like that was her, like, people, I need students to be here, like step one. Like if nothing else happens, people in the seats. And then whereas at UConn, I remember Holly, what's her name, Holly Jeffcoat, is that, but Holly was like, I want you to walk in and know it's a library. Like, what does that even mean? Like, do you need to see a book when you walk in? Do you need to see a person? Like, we need to triage and figure out what people want and how we can get it for them. But like, she wanted it to be about walking in, feeling within a library and feeling the like academia around you, like the energy of that, which is just a wonderful thing, right? It's, I mean, they're both very interesting takes on the library, but once you start with that, like, what's the big idea? Then I think we do a lot of like, okay, how do you work this in with other future, other trends we're seeing? Like, how do we look at peer institutions? We're seeing more and more of that where they say, give us some benchmarks for like what other institutions who are kind of at our, at our caliber or serve similar, communities, like what are they doing? What can we be doing better? So it's a little bit of an exploration in that way.
I think the best projects are the ones that kind of smash those two ideas like right up next to one another, where there are sacred spaces or some sacred spaces or traditional spaces. To use the Boston Public Library as an example, Bates Hall, which was that grand reading room that we showed on a couple slides. Like Bates Hall will always be Bates Hall. It's always going to look like that. It's one of the most impressive monumental public spaces in the city of Boston. But it's going to be in the same library as other spaces that are very forward thinking, very innovative, and very different than what was there previously. And I think that's the type of dichotomy between two things that can make a really, really interesting user experience.
Well, thank you for sharing your ideas. Our task has been basically to get students in our library, so you basically covered that for us, so thank you for that. All right, I'm going to ask
Yeah.
last round for questions.
There's got to be some student
Oh,
questions.
we have a question.
All right. Gold
Hi.
star. Hi.
So I was asking, since we're doing the evolving library and essentially bringing in spaces that are providing a place for new technology and like very specialized technology as well, how do you go about talking to staff, because the staff not doesn't necessarily have those skills sometimes to help keep those spaces running, and how do you guys approach it in a sense of like not scaring them in a way? Because I feel
It's a
like
really
This is like the million
it's an
dollar
insightful
question.
question. Yeah,
yeah.
no, that's it's really insightful. It's a great question, and it's certainly a challenge, a big one, because libraries in a lot of cases they've been doing, they've been offering the same type of services and the same type of spaces for a long time, and their staff is very used to that and familiar to that. With that, so the idea of changing that and providing services or resources in a new way is really, it can cause a lot of anxiety. And I think what we can do as architects and designers is to offer a lot of encouragement and a lot of support and show and illustrate, much like we've done this evening. We're always looking at our peers, always looking at what else is happening in the library world. We don't operate in a bubble. So we can show them and demonstrate to them how others, institutions that are similar to them, either in program or size or community or whatever, how they've, started to do that. There's always somebody who's out there who's doing it. It may not be for very long, but you can help share those experiences with the group that you're working with, and encourage them along. And it has a lot to do with leadership too.
Yeah.
You can encounter certainly leadership that, like I said, is just very familiar with the way they've been doing things, and change is very challenging to think about. And then there's other leaders who embrace that and want that, and want to shake things up. And it's in those types of experiences where things can really take off.
Hmm. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think there's a certain amount of engagement with the staff to understand what they quite like about what they do, and what doesn't quite work. I mean, I think if they know you're coming in not to give them the solution, but to learn from them and learn with them what is best for the building, that's one thing, showing that kind of humility and curiosity of them. But I do think the leadership is important, because ultimately, eventually someone needs to make the decision. And ideally that's not the architect. The architect brings lots of things and ideas and examples and precedents, but like at the end of the day, someone needs to like stand behind it and run with it long term. So I think it is definitely a like multi-pronged kind of change management endeavor. And but that's really working, I think, with any institution on any project. You encounter that, so it's just unfortunately part of the assignment, but also I think part of what is so exciting and rich and makes each project so different and unique.
Well, that was great insight. It's perfect for our class. So we are just about out of time. I want to thank you both for a great presentation. Thank you for joining us virtually here at LTU.
Of course. Thank you
You're
so
very
much for
welcome.
having us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having us, and certainly feel free to reach out if you all have any follow-up questions, or
Will
want
do.
some more
Thank you very
framework for
much.
anything that we presented.
Okay.
Good.
Awesome. Have a good one.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.